Predictable revenue doesn't come from better forecast. It actually comes from better habits. So why do so many leadership teams keep searching for new tools, new models, or new metrics while ignoring the disciplines that actually make revenue predictable over time? Last episode, we talked about RevOps as part of a commercial operating system. Today, we're making that tangible. If I'm a leader listening and asking, what actually changes on my calendar, my day-to-day when RevOps is working? This episode is for you. Hi, I'm Courtney Baker, and this is AI Know-How from Knownwell. As always, I'm joined by David DeWolf, Mohan Rao, and Pete Buer. We're also bringing you part 2 of our guest interview with NYU Professor and author of Thinking with Machines, Dr. Vasant Dhar. But first, Pete Buer joins us to break down some of the latest in AI news. Hey, Pete, how are you?
I'm good, Courtney. How are you?
I'm doing great. Pete, Deloitte just announced they're scrapping traditional job titles for their entire U.S. workforce. We're talking 181,500 people. No more senior consultant or manager. Instead, they'll be software engineer 3 or get an alphanumeric code like L45 or maybe R2D2 if you're really lucky. They're calling it a modernization, but it feels like we really are turning into the gerbils I sometimes joke about being on my computer, on my walking pad with my number as a job title. Pete, what do we take away from this?
Well, Courtney, if you believe everything you read, the only pyramids we'll be seeing 5 years from now are the ones in Cairo and the Yucatan. The traditional consulting pyramid structures
Mhm.
is going away thanks to the impact of AI, and Deloitte, one of the biggest services companies in the world, is on the front lines of reinvention. So effective June 1, 2026, not that far away, all 181,000 plus U.S. Deloitte employees get new titles. That traditional progression that we're so familiar with and that governs so many companies, from analyst to consultant to senior consultant to manager, is being replaced with role-specific titles tied to job families and subfamilies. And as you referenced, internally, everyone gets an alphanumeric level. L45 corresponds to what we know today as senior consultants, L55 to managers. And there's a new leadership tier across the group simply called leaders that sits below partners, principals, and managing directors. Deloitte's stated reason for the changes is that the current structure that was designed for traditional consulting profiles is simply outdated now. For us, this is the first high-profile evidence of a change that we've been talking about and that we've been watching for. The old consulting model, predicated on armies of junior consultants doing grunt work, goes away when AI can take over the grunt work and then some. So, what does this mean for services leaders who are tuned in? And I think there are lessons for companies of any size based on what we're seeing go down at Deloitte. If step 1 is reshape the organization, many say that the pyramid will be replaced by a diamond as technology steps in to do the bottom layers of work. I assume step 2 then will be to rethink how you charge customers uh, with this model when work's being done by technology rather than great big teams. And we're starting to see some evidence of this out there in companies that we talk to. Step 3, then, one that's particularly interesting for me, is the hard thinking that has to be done about workforce planning. There are huge implications in all this for employee value proposition, career journeys, bench building, development, promotion rates, you name it. I think everything about the employee relationship to the business gets touched in this process. So, final thought. This is the most significant and public acknowledgement that I've seen yet that AI is about to turn org structures on their ear.
Okay, Pete.
you know much more about this world than I do. And so much of what this news is really interesting to me, actually. But I still don't get the alphanumeric naming
Right.
of
Why don't they
roles.
just why don't they just call them like Henry and Waldo? Like, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Like, can you just give it a name? Like, use words because 'cause we're humans and that's what we use? We use words? I don't understand.
It
Um,
can't be satisfying to, come home all excited about your new job and tell your wife that I'm at L55 now.
right?
But you know what?
I am
I guess
now an
yeah,
L55!
but the government's been doing this for ages, so, like, maybe somehow, corporate, America is taking guidance from government.
But,
Wouldn't that
Pete,
be
how many
ironic?
people are like, "Guys, I'm so excited I'm gonna work for government." Like, no one, no one.
Oh,
I'm
well,
concerned for Deloitte for the marketing of wanting to actually work there legitimately. I think for those folks that are like, you know, which I don't know, maybe nobody no, maybe there aren't creatives like me that are interested in working there anymore, but it's just baffling to me. That's the one part of this I truly cannot understand. Pete, this is so helpful. Thank you for breaking down the news and helping me understand the world, okay? Pete, thank you as always.
thank you, Courtney.
RevOps, expanding post-sell, sounds great in theory, as you know if you listened to last week's episode. But what does it look like in practice? I sat down with David and Mohan recently to discuss. David, Mohan, in our last episode, we kind of laid out the idea of commercial operations, really this expanded RevOps into commercial ops, the full life cycle. And we kind of said, hey, predictable revenue doesn't just come from better forecast. It comes from better habits, better disciplines. So today, I want to make this tangible. If I am a leader listening and asking, what actually changes about my day to day? What does it mean for my calendar, for example? How would you two answer that?
Yeah, so I'd start by breaking this down let's just look at your core question of what changes. And the first thing I think of is there's a fundamental shift that happens where you move from making decisions based on gut feel to making decisions based on data and evidence, right? Signaling. And so I think that's a fundamental shift you have to make. Now, in that, I think there is also a shift that happens from being reactive to proactive. This is about eliminating the ad hoc scramble because something's gone wrong and we have the signal from the client to having a proactive, disciplined management system that anticipates issues, leverages the signals to get ahead of them. And I think that proactivity really, really matters and is one of the fundamental changes. With that, what goes into that? Well, I think there's a couple of things, right? When I think about the rigor and the discipline, there's clear roles and responsibilities, right? Do we actually know who's accountable for what so they can actually be an owner and exercise that extreme ownership? Is there in the management system not just clear ownership, but a rhythm, right? What's the battle rhythm? What is that consistent cadence of accountability that drives the machinery and creates the momentum, right? So having a meeting cadence that the right intervals with the right people to ask the right questions, to look at the right data in order to drive the execution in a way towards this strategy of being proactive and being foot forward as opposed to reactive, right? Those are the fundamentals. And then I think about other things that have to shift with it as well. Like instead of an annual planning of accounts, we should be doing continuous live account planning. And those account plans can no longer be something we dust off the shelf on a quarterly basis. They've got to be something that we actually live by and execute with. And it's just an artifact that we check in on, not one we produce for the meeting, right? So those are the different levels of things. But I'd go back to it's decision making by data, not gut. it is that cadence, it's that proactivity. Those are the basics that we have to instill.
Yeah, I think of it as a set of non-negotiable operating rhythms where you're surfacing risk, forcing reconciliation between teams. Sales may be selling something, but delivery is unable to do that in time, right? So that is a forced reconciliation internally that has to be surfaced and then drive the collective ownership of revenues, right? I mean, that's what it is.
Sure.
And the way you do it, Courtney and David, is through a set of rhythms, something along the lines of a weekly portfolio triage, right? So focus is not on status, but what change, what is the signaling, having these conversations internally, then moving to a monthly portfolio review where you're aligning pipeline, delivery capacity, financial reality, just sort of not be too optimistic about it and think that we'll make it up in the next quarter, a hard monthly portfolio revenue review. And then a weekly revenue control where you're getting sales and finance to forecast on movement. And as you can see, I'm using the word movement a lot because things are so dynamic and they're changing. You can't do this forecasting once a quarter and say, we'll make that happen. You're constantly adjusting back and forth. And then there's a monthly growth forecast that you may have to say, even though we did a quarterly growth forecast, we're going to do a monthly update to that and just see where things are and what's the data-driven planning. And then finally, a quarterly business review of finding the pattern recognition over time. Systematically, are we underestimating, overestimating, what is working, what's not working, what processes should we put in place? These are all the elements of a good RevOps process.
And I feel like we should encourage people because what I find is very rarely is there a post-sales meeting cadence even outlined. Everybody has a meeting cadence because they are showing up to some meetings, I know. But an actual intentional meeting cadence of any kind, you will be a big step ahead of your competition. But Mohan, I totally agree. The structure that you just set out is like best in class post-sales.
Yeah, and I would add to that just to double down on it. Oftentimes we get the question, well, how do we start? Like, what's the low-hanging fruit I should do? And there's really two fundamental things at the basis of all this. And the very first one I start with is exactly what Mohan just laid out. If you can start having a weekly triage where you are sitting down and every week you are reviewing the top 5 accounts who your signals have dipped and said are the accounts that have gone red the most over the last 5 weeks. And you can sit around and say, what are we going to do about this? And triage that and kick off the efforts to drive the execution. And then if you can have a monthly review of stepping back and looking at the list of all of your clients and who's red, who's yellow, who's green, who's been there for a while versus just dipped in and then came out, right? And how do we specifically, the big driver in most of these organizations is taking those mediocre clients who are happy but not raving fans, and how do you serve them better to tick them up to be raving fans? If you look at that on a monthly basis, and you just put in place those 2 meetings and you run them with rigor and discipline, meaning you then, number 2, right after the meeting cadence, you got to get the data so that you can signal these things and you know what accounts to talk about, right? And you know how to talk about them. So for the weekly meeting, you need the top 5 that dipped, right? For the monthly meeting, you need all of your accounts and how they score, right? Where are they? And if you can marry that meeting cadence with that data and then lead a great meeting that is engaging. This is not a status review, come in and give me a report, how's the account going? This is come in, no, account A looks like it's dipped in satisfaction by 27% in the last week. What happened? What's going on? What are we doing about who's responsible? And what is our commitment to come back next week and make sure it's on track? And then next week, you follow up with that and you say, hey, 27%, we said we were going to get it to recovering 12% of that. Where are we at? Right? And you can hold people accountable and drive behavior change. That's where the value comes from. And so meeting cadence, data, married together, run a great meeting.
Okay, I'm going to put you two on the spot, but I think you can do it. You two You're the brain and the
Uh-oh.
scientist is
She's
what I've
she's
heard.
buttering us up now,
Yeah.
Mohan.
Yeah, setting us up.
Word on the street, that's the nicknames being thrown around for you too. Although, Mohan, I hear you don't like the scientist, you like the magician instead. That's also the word on the street.
Scientists are humans too, but that's okay.
Okay, I'm putting you two on the spot. Quantifiable impact from executing the things that you just said. Like, what does that do in a business? Obviously, you're kind of estimating here, but just to like put a number, like, what do you think that changes in a business when you go from not having those things to having it?
Yeah, I can start off and reflect on our own internal meetings, and I can almost hear David's voice here, right? So
Uh-oh.
the weekly portfolio triage meeting should be about managing what's changed and not giving status updates, right? So that is a clear marker. If people are coming in saying, "Here's the da status," that is not in the right spirit of
Mhm.
RevOps, right? So, and then forcing a reality alignment where everybody has a seat at the table and just kind of dealing with reality as opposed
Mhm.
to just sort of forecasting as hope, right? So that is a visible change that you should be seeing. And then pattern recognition. So what's working, what's not working. Those are all three concrete things that you can see once you start implementing these.
So, I'm going to take this from a different angle. I'm going to answer with the data, and I think this is a little bit hard because this is a new area that we're pioneering around applying this discipline
Mhm.
to existing accounts, right? And so we have to look at other areas of business that have benefited from similar change and what was the impact. But there's plenty of research on what happens when you do use rigor and discipline in other areas of the business. And there are things such as different studies that have been done around in a sales organization, 28 to 30% lift in sales performance, right? When you have this type of rigor and discipline. There's all sorts of research around profitability in organizations. And a lot of those claim mid 30% increases, right? Of profitability when you run rigorous management systems, right? So we can go out and we can look at these research studies and we should add some to the release notes of very specific ones. But I absolutely believe, based on anecdotes and then these adjacent reports, that we're talking at least a 30% increase in performance in our account base. When you think about that, if that is coming from 80% of your revenue, right? And the average firm, 80% of their revenue comes from their existing accounts, right? So 80% of your revenue every year, 30% improvement. That's pretty significant. That's about a
Yeah.
24% increase in performance across the board. And I can totally see that, right? I was just talking to somebody earlier today. Last year, they sold enough to have 28% growth, but they had a hole in the bucket that was costing them 19, 20%,
Mm.
right? That's an easy lift. And if you're losing that amount of revenue in churn, imagine the upsell and the expansion you're losing. I can totally believe that is a 30 to 40% increase in performance across the board in the
Yeah.
company. And it's not just going to be revenue growth, it's going to be profit growth as well, because we
Right.
all know our existing accounts are much more profitable because we don't have the cost of sale associated with it.
Right.
We just have to serve them really well.
That's exactly right. Because if there's one thing about sales and marketing, we do know how to spend some money.
Yes, you do, Courtney.
Yeah, not me.
Yeah,
I'm
no, you do.
quite budget-minded, if I do say so myself. Okay, this is so good. Such rich conversation. I hope for everybody listening that this starts to put some really practical tools in your toolbox as you start to think about how RevOps for clients looks, how
what we're calling commercial operations starts to shift and change, and some tactical, practical steps that you would need to make to execute a really great discipline process. So if this is interesting to you, on the next episode, we're going to be diving into how do you start to implement commercial operations without slowing the business down, without pausing everything, because nobody can do that. How do you actually ignite change to see some of these things become reality? So that will be on our next episode. David, Mohan, thank you as always.
So fun.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, David.
If you were just listening to the discussion and thinking, we need this kind of discipline in my company, well, you're not alone. Be sure to join our upcoming webinar on RevOps for clients later this month. We'll be talking through even more practical ways you can extend the discipline of RevOps through the whole customer lifecycle. You can register to join us at knownwell.com/RevOps. Dr. Vasant Dhar is a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science, and one of the world's leading authorities on prediction, data science, and trust in AI. His new book is called Thinking with Machines: The Brave New World of AI, and it's a great read. Seriously, you should check it out. Here is part 2 of his conversation with Pete Buer.
Trust is a theme that comes up in our conversations a lot and has come up in a number of places in your book as well. You talk in one place about how minor tweaks to your inputs to an LLM can result in major differences in outputs. And you kind of come away from that thinking variability at some level is just sort of nature of the beast in working with AI at some point. But to the extent that business leaders want and need trustworthiness and reliability in their AI-powered tools and processes, what do they do with this reality?
So let me just tie this to what we were just talking about,
Good.
right? And then we'll move on to LLMs, right? So let's look at trust first. Like, what does it even mean, right? So I started thinking about trust, like, seriously, about 15 years ago. I'd been running this hedge fund for 20 years at that time. I had addressed a lot of other problems like sports. I'd worked with the San Antonio Spurs on trying to improve outcomes through data. I'd done some work in medical diagnosis. I started thinking about driverless cars. And to me, the question was, why was I willing to trust an algorithm that was wrong almost half the time? You know, whereas I was not willing to trust it at that time anyway. I would not trust a driverless car. I wouldn't take my hands off the wheel, even though the error rate is so low. And so I came to the conclusion that it actually, and this seems so obvious and trite in retrospect, when I think about it, which is that trust in anything, especially an algorithm, depends on how often it's wrong and the consequences of error when it's wrong. And those two things like combine, and that seems so obvious now, right? Which is that if a machine never makes a mistake, well, then you should obviously trust it, right?
Yeah.
What reason is there not to do so, right? Now, if it rarely makes a mistake and those mistakes are not consequential, again, it's not a big deal. Trust it. So if you're reviewing like a little standard kind of legal contract and it's a simple problem, then you could probably trust that, the machine will do a good job. On the other hand, if the cost of error is really high, right? And so even though the machine doesn't make that many mistakes, but the cost of error is really high, like it can kill you, like in a driverless car, then you're not going to trust it. You're going to say, no, thank you very much. I want to keep my hands on the wheel, right? So I developed this thing called a trust heat map in terms of these two dimensions, right? So the vertical axis is how often is the machine wrong, right? So on the extreme right, it's never wrong. On the extreme left, it's no better than random. And then on the vertical axis is the cost of error. And sort of the answer seemed obvious, which is that towards the bottom right, you should trust the machine. Towards the top left, you should never trust it. And there's an automation frontier that sort of connects the bottom left to the top right. And that's sort of where most of the action is, right? That's where you're making improvements to a process or a decision through better data. And you're sort of trying to cross over that frontier into the automation zone. So urban taxis are a great example of that, right? So I'm in San Francisco today. I trust Waymos to drive me around. It's quite a trip sitting in these driverless taxis. And they seem incredibly safe, because they're chugging along at 25, 30 miles an hour. Even if they hit something, chances are, they're not going to kill you. So the cost of error is low. Whereas if you're driving at 70 miles an hour on a highway, that's a different kind of proposition. So that's how I tend to think about trust, is in terms of, these two dimensions. Now, let's get to the other thing that you raised, which is the variability
Mhm.
of these LLMs, because one of the things I've discovered, and it's become real to me, is over the last couple of years, I've been working on building this thing called the Damodaran bot that values publicly traded companies. And it's based on the thinking of my colleague, Aswat Damodaran, who's considered a sort of valuation guru, on Wall Street. So I built a system with some of my colleagues that values companies. But guess what? If you run it today versus tomorrow versus day after, the outputs are slightly different. It's not going to give you the same report every time. It's not going to give you the same valuation every time. But the question is, are those valuations all over the place, or are they in a relatively tight range? And if they're in a relatively tight range, the variance is low, trust is higher. Whereas if the valuations are all over the place, you're not going to trust it. So in building this Damodaran bot and evaluating it, one of the things that we did very rigorously was run it like over and over again and look at this sort of variability that you get, right? And we found that the variability is something like 5 to 7%, which is not bad, right? Whereas if you run an LLM out of the box, like DeepSeek or Deep Research or something like that, the variance can be something like 30%, 20, 30%, right? Much higher. So that's how you sort of evaluate these kinds of systems, right? In terms of their stability or lack thereof. And that's a major determinant of trust.
Do you feel like leadership teams in most companies understand this and are able to apply this kind of thinking to the way that they introduce AI-powered products or the way they introduce AI-driven services with customers?
Not enough, to be honest. At the moment, I see a lot of FOMO. I see hope, like let's just throw money at this problem and expect something good will happen. Those are not good business strategies, right? I get asked this question all the time. How should leaders think about it? And I say they should exercise what Danny Kahneman calls slow thinking, right? This isn't something where you get in because of FOMO or hope or anything like that. You got to like think through this carefully, um, and determine, as we were talking earlier, where are the largest benefits, right? And so my trust heat map, for example, is a useful tool to prioritize or order problems, right? Because all other things being equal, I would rather implement things that have a high probability of success, where I'll be able to trust the algorithm. And so problems that lie sort of towards the bottom right, all else being equal, right? Those are the ones I'll take, that have low risk. So that's how I think about it. But at the moment, I don't think the thinking is sufficiently sophisticated. I do see exceptions. And again, I ask this question all the time. And my answer is that it's a little too early to tell, who the winners and losers are going to be. But I do see some organizations that have become, what they call, AI first. And the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an AI first organization? And the one example I came across was this Indian company called Infosys, which the chairman of the board, Nandan Nilekani, real visionary. He's developed India's sort of Aadhaar program, this sort of biometric thing. And I asked him, like, what does that mean? What does AI first mean? And now I get it, because what it really means is that it's used in every part of the business. So you let programmers use LLMs, let's say, to write code, but then you evaluate their outputs. How good is the code? Are there fewer errors? Are they coding faster? Is the quality of the programs better? How does QA work with the programmers? What's the impact of AI on the output? How does it work with marketing, right? So it infuses through all aspects of the organization, not just one sort of little piece of it. And this, by the way, looks different for every organization, right? So Infosys is something that, it makes software, but what would it mean for an insurance company to be AI first? Something completely different. And a couple of years ago, the head of, one of these insurance companies' underwriting business came to me and said, I'd like to use AI to improve underwriting. That is, and I said, well, do you want to automate? And she said, no, I'd like to actually make it better. I'd like to make humans better at what they do. And I don't quite know what that really means, So it took us 3 to 6 months to actually understand what that really means, right? In the insurance company, it's a B2B business in their case. And so one had to sort of understand how they make decisions to take risk and what it means to be a better underwriter. Does it mean that, you should know whether some sources of policies that you're underwriting are less risky than others? Are certain brokers giving you better business than others, right? All of those questions need to be answered, and yet they never get answered because people don't ask the question, right? And if you're not going to ask the question, those answers won't, reveal themselves to you automatically. You have to sort of look for them. And the interesting thing is that organizations do have the data to answer many of the questions that they should be asking, but they never ask the questions. And to me, that's a leadership issue, right? So in this case, when the head of the business came and said, I don't know what this really means, but I want to think through this with you as to what it means to improve underwriting. And, we did discover what that meant and came up with a solution. And then the next part is, how do you then infuse it into the organization? How do you actually do the change management, which is one of the hardest parts
Yes.
of businesses, right? People have ways of doing things. It's very difficult to change processes and get people to do things differently, right? So finding the solution is half the problem, or it's only half the solution. The much harder part oftentimes is, how do you really then implement the change in the organization? And that varies by every organization. So there's no one answer to this.
I'm watching the clock and realizing that while I would love to spend the rest of the day together, we have a commitment to get you on to whatever's next. Can I just say, though, that you're thinking in the book and together just speaking today, it's amazing how you're able to put such what would otherwise be relatively complicated concepts into a simple language and clear pragmatic guidance for business leaders. And so I appreciate that in our conversation. And I'll once again guide folks to your book, Thinking with Machines, for more of the same. But there's also a podcast I want to make sure that we reference before we break. And so can you tell us about Brave New World?
Yeah, so Brave New World is a podcast that started 5 years ago, and it's about the world our future selves would like to inhabit. Right? So it's a really broad sort of a vision. And I've had like amazing people, on that podcast. I also have a newsletter on Substack that accompanies each podcast. My last guest was Deepak Chopra, and we were talking about consciousness and reality. So it was like really kind of a mind-bending kind of conversation. Prior to that, it was, David Coe, who's the CEO of Calm. But I've had all kinds of really interesting conversations. Anil Seth on consciousness and reality. Danny Kahneman earlier, on about noise and this sort of variability in businesses. So I've had like, really awesome guests on the podcast and great conversations. But thanks for the compliment, Pete, about the book, because I wrote it for everyone, right? So this is written, it's meant to be accessible to everyone, and that's how I've written it. It's written for students, teachers, business leaders, my colleagues, policymakers. There's something in it for everyone. So appreciate the fact that you appreciate that.
Yes, and it very much plays that way. And you can count on one more subscriber each to your Substack and your podcast. As of 2 minutes from now, I'll be getting on board. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to spend time together, and we're grateful for your sharing of your insights.
Thanks as always for listening and watching. Don't forget to give us a review on your podcast player of choice or wherever you're watching this. And we'd really appreciate it if you would share this episode with someone you know would enjoy it. At the end of every episode, we'd like to ask one of our AI friends to weigh in on the topic at hand. So, hey, Claude, welcome to the show. Today, we're talking about RevOps and the disciplines behind predictable revenue, especially when you extend RevOps beyond the sell. Do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Break down those silos between sales, marketing, and success if you want predictable revenue. And don't sleep on post-sale. That's where you either build recurring growth or watch churn kill everything you worked for.
And now, you're in the know. Thanks as always for listening. We'll see you next week with more AI applications, discussions, and the first part of an interview with CX expert Alyssa Nolte, and you'll definitely want to hear it. Hey, if you made it this far in the episode, first of all, thank you. And second, we know that AI is changing all the time, and so we've got you covered. Here is another great episode for you to watch to stay in the loop on what's happening in AI and business. And second of all, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can do that right here. I've always wanted to do that, by the way. So do that now. That would be great.